Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Daniel Peabody. I am director at Elizabeth Leach Gallery, and on behalf of myself and Elizabeth and Gwendolyn and the rest of the team, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. We have with us tonight Grace Kook-Anderson, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art Portland Art Museum, and she's here in conversation with Ryan Pierce, our artist we've worked with for many years, and who has a current exhibition, Awake Under Vines, on view through May 29th of this year. You can visit the gallery Tuesday through Saturday, 10:30 to 5:30, and face masks are required. And we're not requiring appointments at this point, but we're just welcoming people to stop by and come in. But we are kind of limiting capacity to around 10 people to be in accordance, in alignment with all of the COVID protocols. So please stop by and see the show in person and join us for this conversation. There is a comment thread where whether you're joining us on our gallery website or YouTube or Facebook Live, you can comment or ask questions, and we will save the questions to the end and then answer them at that time. So without further ado, let me welcome Grace and Ryan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Kelly created the great video introduction, so rather than kind of give a big intro to each of you, I'm just going to kind of get right to what everyone's here for and welcome you both. And it's just a thrill to have you both here. I know Grace, I know you're very familiar with Ryan's work, having carried him into the exhibition, The Maps of the Territory, at the Portland Art Museum a few years ago, the regional triennial. And so I'm really excited to hear your conversation. So I'm just going to pass it right off to the two of you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Grace, could I just start by thanking you, Daniel, and I want to recognize that Daniel's been with the gallery for 15 years this week, and he does so much for art and artists, and Daniel, as well as you, Grace, have been such amazing advocates for me in my career and such great supporters. So I'm really grateful to be here with both of you. And, you know, as an artist, you often toil in obscurity, and then you get these people who, like Grace or Daniel, who just say, whatever you need, call me in the middle of the night. And then I show up and call you in the middle of the night, and you come out and you're like, who are you? Get the hell away from my house. But anyways, I'm very grateful for your support, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Ryan. I want to talk about how I got to know you first and kind of our history at CCA in San Francisco. Were you getting your MFA at that time? And I was getting my MA in curatorial practice, and we shared a writing class with Kevin Killian, which was amazing. I wish I had known how much more amazing it was. But, you know, when we were young, I think I just kind of didn't appreciate it as much as I should have. But I remember your writing so well because it just stood out to me. The density of it, the kind of sci-fi nature of it, certainly your deadpan humor, all of that kind of came through. And I think it just has stayed with me because that has stayed kind of consistent even in the imagery of your work. So for those of you who haven't heard this story about us, I just wanted to share that with the rest of you because it really did. It's definitely made an impression, and it's a mark in my mind. And I'm so thrilled that I got to continue to stay in touch and work with you in this capacity. It's been really wonderful, and just to see how you just continue to evolve in your work is just amazing to witness.
Thank you.
So should we, I think Ryan and I talked about maybe doing some deep dives. I just want to say I've been getting out into the galleries a little bit more these days, and everyone has been doing such a great job at making you feel safe and making sure that not too many folks are in the galleries at the same time. You can make appointments or knock on the door. It's been really great. And if you can, please do see the exhibition for yourself, because certainly nothing compares to being able to see the work in person. Ryan, do you want to start? Is there a painting you want to start with first that we can do a deep dive into?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe I'll just frame the exhibition by saying that my sort of ongoing major project is a portrayal of the effects of climate change on our world, sometimes pictured in the near future and sometimes arguably the present. It's a little hard to tell. And within that larger body of work, I pursue sub-projects, and this one is called Jubilee. And this is my second exhibition of the Jubilee project. And Jubilee is really about envisioning the possibilities after the collapse of the capitalist system. And so it's a pretty buoyant show and dense as usual, and very messy. There's a lot of disarray. There's a lot of references to climate chaos, but there's also kind of an exuberance in the work. And Grace and I were discussing that when we were kind of planning this talk out. So maybe we'll start with After the Treehouse Fell. And props to Kelly, who's on the boards here, pulling up images as we request them. Is this a good place to start, Grace?
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about that, because it has been something I've been feeling really deeply. Just I think every week has felt different, just with the state of our world, all of our issues right now. And I think somewhere along the way, I kind of forgot about kind of the joy and the levity of things. And I've been really kind of seeking that out, and also trying to be more mindful about that aspect of joy. Joy can be had in activism. Joy can be had in a moment of uprising. There's many ways to find this. So yeah, so thanks for sharing that. And when I saw the exhibition, I really appreciated that, because it was really hitting me at that moment when I was having these feelings too. So thank you for that. Yeah, so yeah, shall we begin with this one? And the title of this piece is After the Treehouse Fell. And I love this kind of disarray, this kind of collapse of just this imagery of just everything just collapsing, and imagining sort of somewhat of where the placement of all these items were.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about this piece, and maybe we can look at details as well.
Yeah, well, as I'm looking at it now, I'm remembering drawing it, and in my process of planning a painting, I make a full-size one-to-one drawing and transfer it to the canvas. And in this work, and in another one we're going to talk about called Flash Flood, the scale is approximately life-size. And so I'm remembering trying to capture this sense of frenzy of this giant spill on like a picnic blanket, and like really trying to feel that with my body as I drew it, and to pencil these things out in a way that really felt like I was disoriented as I was making it. And in this one, it's a little bit of a outgrowth of some previous work I made, which I was just calling thing paintings. And my thing paintings did not really occupy any believable pictorial space. And they were an attempt to evoke a narrative through the juxtaposition of different objects. In some cases, really recognizable objects. And in some cases, kind of hybridized objects or slightly mysterious objects, like that doughy face on a rolling pin, or the robotic hand touching the squash, things like that. And so in my mind, it's like a nonlinear narrative that the viewer is invited to get in and puzzle out and sort of make the story up for themselves. Well, the story that I told myself was kind of one of a secret society of activists, people who were resisting climate change development, and they had this treehouse that was like their place for meetings and bacchanalia and plotting. And then one day the branch broke, and it all just kind of collapsed in one sort of orchestral crash. And yeah, so that was the impetus for this one.
That's so great. And I noticed there are images that come up in several of the other paintings, like that wig, the kind of pink wig on the upper left corner, and also the imagery of vines. I mean, it's in the title of this show, Awake Under Vines, but the imagery of vines come up in your work quite a bit. Can you talk about that? Is it this kind of, I mean, when I think of vines, I think of our kind of the ivy that just kind of creeps into everything, and that's not native, but I don't know what representation it has in your paintings.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like the duality of like regeneration and also, vines will like wrap a thing up and almost cocoon it and overtake it. And anytime I see like a plant breaking through the asphalt, it stops me in my tracks. And the title of the show, Awake Under Vines, I was kind of thinking of, and I'm not even sure I'm remembering this right, I didn't go back to look, but I was kind of thinking of a scene from Gulliver's Travels where I think it's the Lilliputians, and Gulliver wakes up and tied down by vines, and just thinking of like, again, this like the disorientation of a paradigm shift that really like elevates the natural world to become in control of human systems, which has been a through line in all my creative work for 20 years. So yeah, the vines are just like always there, like in the paintings and in real life, like slowly growing, patient, overtaking, whether we're looking or we're not. And I think that's also for me like an analogy of like the patience that it takes to hold on to hope in like really dark times and think about pursuing that systemic change.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly different elements of time in this painting too. I was just seeing that lantern crash and the broken glass that you capture so well in this painting, but then the fire kind of catching onto the stool and onto this branch, this kind of immediacy of that moment. Yeah, nature certainly has a lot of different kind of moments of time in this way.
Yeah, and I should say that broken head that you see in this detail is a bust of John Muir, and it's a reference to sculptures of severed conquistador heads that I made out of ceramics about 10 years ago, and that I made into planters. And I didn't actually make this one, but it's sort of like like a riff on one of my own sort of dead ideas. And there's a couple images in this show of monuments to like, I don't know, like white men who are sort of revered in the environmental movement in the US at this time. And in my sort of future portrayal, those monuments are sort of like desecrated or defaced or like put to sleep, and in some cases just sort of like forgotten and submerged.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm curious, does Audubon come into your imagery at all too?
I haven't hit Audubon yet, but watch out.
Yeah, maybe that one could be next.
Yeah.
Well, that imagery, I mean, is so interesting. We talked about this earlier. Certainly, this trajectory on climate change, and I don't know how long this has been a part of your thinking in your paintings, but just in the last few years, since I've been in Portland, seeing your exhibition at PSU, there's been this sort of trajectory of looking at the conquistadors and the kind of the collapse of those ideas, and they're almost caricatured, right, with their kind of pointy beards and their costumes, but and then in sort of your in sort of these other series, there's aspects of reciprocity, of nature taking over, of kind of the demise of these kind of cabinets of curiosity, the kind of immediate archaeology of these aspects. And all of those things kind of play into this show and this new body of work. But there's also a real great sense of playfulness that comes through in all of them.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good chance to step to the next image, Kelly. Maybe we could talk about Flash Flood, the yellow one. Because this is sort of the larger cousin to that Treehouse Falls painting, and picnic blankets appear in almost every painting in this show. And I think maybe that's a longing from a COVID lockdown place of just wanting like to be outside with friends and thinking of this like I don't know, like the picnic as this sort of like place of momentary tranquility within a wild landscape. And like you have food and drink and comfort, and that's sort of like the only reference to domesticity in any of these works.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've been talking about picnics a lot right now, and just finding like maybe thinking that could be like my weekly, our weekly dinner thing of just making sure we go out and eat outdoors. But I think too with picnics, there's a sense of leisure that comes through, right? Like you're just kind of enjoying the outdoors, but I don't get a sense of leisure in any of these paintings.
No, it's a picnic disaster all the time.
So I have a description here. You write about this painting. It's a imagery that's inspired by your time in the wildlands along the U.S.-Mexico border. That was a trip that you did with Signal Fire. Mm-hmm. Was that like 2 or 3 years ago? I can't remember.
I think for the first time, we went down there in 2014, and then I've been back a few times since, thinking specifically of a wilderness area near Nogales that is this strange confluence of, and the painting like really isn't that far-fetched when you see this place, because there is so much detritus from recreational communities, like the birders come through and they leave each other notes about where to find the birds. And then it's hyper militarized from the US Border Patrol, and they can, at will, they just waive environmental laws and can drive their Jeeps and bring their helicopters through anywhere they want, even though it's a federally protected wilderness on paper. And then, of course, it's a place of human migration and increasingly of climate migration. And there are people like literally fleeing for their lives through this, pretty wild landscape, extremely challenging, extremely life-threatening situations. And then also there's sort of like all the usual land management indicators that we're used to from ranching and, the diversion of water and everything like that. And so you have just this collision of bizarre things, humanitarian aid, the criminalization of humanitarian aid, rock jacks and water jugs and, gorgeous, botanical oddities like occurs in the Southwest. So, yeah.
Yeah. I love how you depict like snakes in your paintings too. Like I find like my eye is always drawn to that. And in this painting too, there's such a great sense of all these layerings that happen. But can you talk about that, this imagery on the right-hand side, this kind of smoky, maybe almost oily or smoky kind of imagery that it kind of is sort of atmospheric?
Sure, yeah. So, one of the things I like to do as I work in layers is kind of challenge myself to interweave them amongst each other. And my process involves a lot of masking with tape, and an interplay of layers, like passing over and under each other. And in this body of work, especially like a lot of transparency. And this work is called Flash Flood. It's 6 by 8 feet, which is sort of like the biggest size of painting that I can comfortably handle by myself in the studio. And so I put it up on sawhorses, and like that to me is the sort of evocation of the flood, is this sideways cloud that just like drips over the whole painting. And so what I did was I drew everything out, covered the entire panel with tape, and then masked it off. And so all of the figure in the work was sealed off as I painted this cloud, and then tipped the panel up and just sort of like flooded my own painting and attempt to kind of like evoke the weather and evoke the chaos through really gestural, expressionistic painterly moves. Mm-hmm. And then unpeel it, clean up my mess, and sort of like work from the background forward and start to layer things, including these flashlights that are like spray painted cones casting, sort of a unbelievable light over things.
Right. This painting is so interesting. It's indicative of all of your work in this way, but you mention all of these contradictory things that are of the land, these imposed things, things that other people bring in. All of these kind of conflicting things are happening. But in this painting, as in a lot of your paintings, the composition is sort of all over composition. There's not more weight given to one imagery or subject. They all kind of seem to hold equal weight or conversation in the painting. And I don't know if that also has to do with this idea of this sort of figuring out this puzzle and coming to, for the viewer to come to terms with all of the imagery or all of the issues that we're sort of confronted with. Can you talk about that intention a little bit, particularly to this painting? Because I love how you set up that experience of seeing all the different contradictions.
Sure. What that makes me think of is what we were talking about the other day about how there's sort of like a lack of gravity in some of these works, and to portray the chaos and the spill, and sort of like let go of believable space. And my early sort of emerging painting career was really grounded in landscape and in, like, say, more or less believable pictorial space. And I think in letting go of that, it's just like it kind of liberates the narrative in a way that you're implying, in the sense that, like, all of these discrete objects can be, they don't, like, have the same pictorial hierarchy that a typical landscape painting does, where everything sort of has its own place. Otherwise, the illusion is messed up. And so, like, of course, this is an impossible scenario. But at the same time, it's sort of like, you know, maybe evokes the disorienting feeling that I'm going for. Mm-hmm. And I should also say that, like, I almost never paint from observation, and maybe that's obvious. I make things up and cook them up in my sketchbook, and I'll pull up reference images for something if it needs to be, like, there's specificity to the botanical items, like this ocotillo plant with the thorns and the pink blossoms. I had some reference for that. And I had reference for the snake. It was actually a snake that I found dead on the side of a cliff in a canyon in the Southwest. And it was just kind of locked in this gorgeous little curlicue of rigor mortis. And so I was able to kind of call up those photographs to inform this. But the rest of it is just concocted from the imagination.
Mm. Yeah, going back to our conversation the other day too, when we were talking about this kind of lack of sort of literal gravity in the painting, I like that you also kind of talked about the shifting times, and you mentioned kind of like wind, flood, wildfire, all of these things that kind of, I guess, how would you describe it, is sort of this literal sort of upending in some ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this past year, we've all had to get more comfortable with living in a tentative frame of mind, and everything like may or may not be canceled. And I think as climate chaos accelerates, just like, I mean, even just like more powerful wind, you know, there's just an unsettling, a baseline unsettling, and what some people call like a global weirding that we need to adapt to in some ways. But it's not any easier for me knowing that it's coming than it is for someone who pretends that it isn't.
Right. Should we move on to The Fugitive? Or
yeah, let's talk about The Fugitive.
Yeah, okay. So there's the wig again.
Yeah, so this is
a mask. The mask appears too often in your work.
Mm-hmm.
What I enjoy so much about this painting, and then the one we'll see later too, is kind of these shadowy figures. And sometimes they're quite sensual, but I like how these figures are really coming in. Maybe, do you want to talk about that aspect of it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is like a new direction in my work, and this painting, I think of it as maybe a little bit of like a turning point or a hint at the next, one possible next development for me. And it's like a very noirish vibe. I think of it as like a climate noir. And it's, so I did make figurative paintings a decade ago, and I felt like the figures were populating my paintings with a density that made it impossible for the viewer to really enter the work themselves. And at that point, I was making pretty much all landscapes. And I was showing sort of scenes of people re-inhabiting the world in a more sustainable way. And so I pulled the people out for a good 10 plus years. And now they're kind of coming back in with mischief in mind. And I think that was what I needed to sort of like surprise myself in the work. But rather than having like believable figures and believable, inhabitants in the picture plane, they're just kind of like shadows and scrims and these kind of like, almost like, what's his name? Like Archimbaldo, sort of like assemblage things made out of props and gloves and underwear and masks and things like that. And to me, they're like members of this secretive political resistance that is always kind of like living behind the painting and responsible for both the sinister elements and the joyful ones.
Yeah. I just have to point out, Christopher Rauschenberg wrote, "Climate noir is a great genre."
Thanks, Chris.
Can we talk about too? So there, the flashlights come in quite a bit in these paintings, but what are they shining on, if anything? Like, do they play any kind of informative investigation into the painting, or are they kind of flashing onto nothingness?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that part a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in this piece, they seem pretty fruitless in their investigation. And I mean, one thing I was thinking about is how we sort of concoct the thing we're looking for these days, and like, especially in our political dialogue. And when I was thinking about maybe like the more hedonistic elements in this body of work, I forget, some like Lindsey Graham or some just like awful person like that had some quote during the last election where he was like, like, if Joe Biden comes to power, it's going to be your worst socialist nightmare. And I was kind of thinking like, oh, what a lack of imagination. Like, I really wish that like, no, actually, there's a lot of us who are like 1,000 degrees left than that. And like you could not handle your worst nightmare, which is like this sort of eco-terrorist paradise that comes through in some of the indications in this work. And then some of it's just like pretty goofy, and I'm straying off topic a little bit, but I'm seeing the like remote control cake, or like maybe a cake that's a bomb, which is just like, there's lots of like implausibly disguised weapons here, like one of the paintings has I think it's the next one we're going to talk about, has a hatchet that's like tied up inside of a Subway sandwich with a necktie. No like artful concealment, just these sort of like heavy-handed gestures towards like integrating resistance into everyday objects.
Mm-hmm. I love that we're on this slide, because I feel like this just shows what a great painter you are. Like that, the kind of sort of off-focus foreground to kind of this crisp middle ground, to like this kind of atmospheric background. You can really feel all the layers. There really is this depth of space that I'm really feeling in this painting. So I just want to point that out.
Thank you.
And also, we talked about this a little bit the other day too, is with this painting and the painting we'll kind of see at the end, like these kind of goofy elements that you mentioned, I can't help but think so much about Robert Colescott's painting because we had his retrospective just earlier at the museum. And, you know, he talks about this kind of detritus in the studio, the things that don't make the canon in art history. And they're often like a slice of pie or a wine bottle, and there are cigarette butts, you know, these things that are kind of floating, so similar to your composition in that way, that they're kind of floating on the ground. But there's something so iconic in that imagery too, that I find really satisfying, like that kind of cartoony bra or the high heel shoes that I feel like I can feel the physicality of those high heel shoes that I used to try to squeeze into my Barbie doll feet.
Yeah.
You know, like there's this very kind of tactile quality, but also something that like immediately registers. And I think too, it's maybe that the cartooniness of that as well.
Yeah, and we were talking when we were talking about Colescott, I was thinking about just kind of a shared interest with Colescott, and as well as like a lot of other painters who are like, broadly speaking, scene makers, and thinking about the cartoony qualities of some of the work and a kinship with stage productions, and like how some of these things I kind of am looking for a vibe of like a play just ended and all the props got like dropped out of order and everything's in disarray, and you have to sort of like figure out what was the plot of the play in retrospect.
That's right. Yeah. Well, shall we go on to the last painting, Ryan?
Yeah, Daniel's joined us.
I'm going to interject just for a moment. You guys, this is such a great conversation. I'm really enjoying it. Thank you. I know we have one more painting we're going to talk about, but I also just wanted to thank everyone for joining us who's online, and encourage people, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comment box. And when we finish talking about the next one, if there are any questions, we will take them at that time. And carry on. I just wanted to kind of remind people of that.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, please do ask your questions. As we look at the last painting, I appreciate so much. You know, Daniel gave me this cheat sheet of notes that you provided, but also just your own bibliography as you think about your own paintings and kind of the books you're reading. And it's so particular in some ways, and again, like how you bring some of those aspects that may or may not be picked up when you look at the paintings, but they certainly inform your work in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. In this last painting that it's called The Ever-Parting Curtain. And I was so drawn to this one because in some ways it really has felt like it, there are, you know, a lot of aspects of your work that I can certainly see, but also the layering feels much more complex. And I was talking about kind of the sensuality of some of the shadowy figures coming in. I really pick up on that in this painting. And then also like the most light aspect in real life would be the balloons, and yet they feel like the most dense, heavy pieces in this painting. Yeah. It really is kind of a mind bend of gravity and things shifting in space. But yeah, what do you have to say about this painting?
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say that doesn't come through in the photographs is that all of this work has metallic paint in it, like, so that Mylar balloon is actually physically reflective as well as being, you know, painterly reflective. And so that especially comes through in these kind of like spray painted silhouettes that appear in a bunch of the paintings. And the way I intended it is that when you move through the gallery, there are figurative elements that emerge from some angles and completely disappear or change color or sort of like lose visual priority as you move around the painting to a different angle. That's something I've been playing with for a few years now, but most directly engaging with it in this work.
Mm-hmm.
And the title for this piece, The Ever-Parting Curtain, again, like a reference to stage and drama, but I was also thinking about the brush with fascism that we just had as a nation, or arguably are still having, and how there's sort of like this sustained expectance of like, okay, well, you know, here we have this despotic leader like saying these terrible things, but certainly he wouldn't enjoy popular support. And oh, well, he is? Okay. Well, now it's time to do something, but not something like irrational. And how, when you talked about the bibliography, I was thinking about how a lot of the reading that informed this body of work were memoirs from partisan fighters or other people who were resisting fascism or far-right governments in the 20th century. And like, what is that moment where you know that it's time to take extreme measures? Like, when is the curtain fully pulled aside? And, you know, we've had national moments recently where we're like, oh my God, there's Nazis in the streets. There's Nazis in my street. There are Nazis at the Capitol. And like, at what point does it really click that this is not business as usual? And so that's what the title refers to there. It's also obviously like a formal device. And my formal approach to this painting was to paint the background and then paint all the stuff and then mask out the stuff again and go back into it and paint these superimposed curtains with silhouette cutouts that sort of overlap and interweave with each other, which was, you know, a pain in the ass, but like that's like really what I get into in the studio. So yeah, just some play.
Right. Maybe I'll end with this sort of comment and question, but yeah, in the last two paintings in particular that we were looking at, you were kind of influenced by these early activists in other countries, and thinking about that moment in history, also that kind of repetition of that history, but also, you know, this culmination of how did you come to think about the series of Jubilee? And because I feel like I really went through the ringer before I thought about this idea of joy. And I shared with you the Coup song that, what is it? Love, Laugh, Fuck, that I think kind of sums up a lot of this. And if you haven't listened to it recently, you should. But how did you come around to it and your kind of commitment to that in this series?
Well, there's like a famous Ursula K. Le Guin quote that I don't remember exactly, but it's something to do with like, it's so challenging to picture the end of capitalism, but you know, it was also challenging to picture the end of kings and monarchies. And I think that in dialogue with other artists I know who are, you know, inspired by activist movements, we often talk about the opportunity to picture the world, or maybe even like a shared responsibility to picture a world for each other, a world of possibility, and to like try to envision this paradigm shift. And I'm not like utopian enough to picture it way in the future in like a very resolved place. I really think about how our lives and the next few generations at least will be living in accelerating climate chaos, you know, no matter what we do, no matter what choices we make. And so it's a dark, bright mess all the time. And I think that like like referencing that Koo song, or the quote about like there will be dancing in dark times. Just thinking about the joy that often accompanies the most urgent means, and people who are living underground and you know, fighting against near hopeless odds, that sort of enables like one to disregard this whole other set of like assumptions and societal shackles, and kind of embrace that that vision.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, Ryan. I guess, should we open it up now to questions?
Yeah.
Great idea. Thank you. We have some great questions. Amy Harwood, who I know you're both familiar with, said, can you talk about Jubilee as a spiritual religious practice, and how it connects to this body of work? And I know you've just touched on that, but I thought you might touch on it a little more.
Oh, good one, Amy Harwood. Yeah, I know that Jubilee is a term embraced by multiple religions, and I was raised Protestant, and I remember that there was like a movement towards debt forgiveness that had Christian underpinnings, that was also associated, like called the Jubilee movement. And I think that I was drawn to the poetry of the word without without personally founding it in religious principles. But I do think that like it connects to this idea of like a restart, or like a wiping clean the slate, which to me is like really different than an apocalypse. It's like human agency is part of that restart, and the idea of like forgiveness, I think, and starting over.
You know, I'm not sure I know the exact definition of the word Jubilee, but in my mind, it somehow seems to connect to, just in the when I hear the word, I think of almost like kind of agricultural communities, and like a Jubilee would be like, it would somehow be associated with harvest. I'm not sure why I think that, but that's kind of the connotation that the word has for me. And I kind of feel like what some of the things you're talking about in terms of climate change and social change. I mean, I think we as a society kind of are at a time where we're harvesting what we've sown, whether both for good and bad, you know, and I think I feel like it has some connotations around that potentially. At least it does for me when I hear you talk about the series.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
We also have another question. Callum Angus says, asks if you could talk about the painting Black Parachutes, which they're saying they stood in front of for a long time when they were here and saw the show. And I think, yeah, Kelly just pulled up an image of it now.
Okay. Kelly, you're so fast. Thank you. Well, thanks for the question, Cal. Nice to see you in the chat. Yeah, this painting, I kind of thought this one might be an outtake, but when I got to the gallery for install, it was on the wall, and Elizabeth was really attached to having that one as one of the centerpieces, and I've come to maybe like it more. And I was kind of thinking of this as like a commando mission gone awry, with my sort of resistance, you know, army, like parachuted in somewhere and got like tangled up in their parachutes and got distracted and started making out, and then just like never got beyond that. And there's like, you know, the picnic reappears, and the rock jacks, and sort of like a spring that makes it, you know, almost a landscape painting, but kind of just like more like a floating scroll painting.
Well, I think there's a lot of great comments, but I'm not seeing any other questions. I would encourage you both, Grace and Ryan, if you haven't looked at the comments in the comment bar, then please make sure you do look at them, because they will. They end up being saved on each platform. So this kind of, when we're here in StreamYard streaming, you can see them from YouTube and Facebook and through our website, but you're not going to see them necessarily all in one place again. So I encourage you to take a look at those while we're still online. But at this point, I just want to thank you both so much for the very rich conversation, and Ryan for the incredible show. Again, the show is Awake Under Vines, and it's on view here at Elizabeth Leach Gallery through May 29th. So there's a few more weeks of the show. So please come and see the paintings in person. Currently, the gallery is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10:30 to 5:30. And we are the doors are unlocked. We're having people come in, face masks are required, and we are keeping attendance to about 10 people beyond staff, just for proper social distancing. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us online and has made the great comments and questions, and also Grace and Ryan so much for joining us this evening. Grace, it's really special to get to work with you again. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And Ryan, it's always wonderful to have your shows in the gallery. I feel very lucky I get to personally live with one of your paintings, and it's so nice to be able to come to work and share them with people as well. So anyway, thank you everyone for joining us, and Ryan and Grace, thank you for joining us, and I think we're gonna say good night. So
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Great to see your names in the chat. I really appreciate it. And hope to see you in the real world soon.
Yes, one day soon.
Thanks so much.